Hello. I have absolutely no idea if I'm live or not. Somebody's waving at me. Great stuff. Hello, Rebecca Pitt. What a fantastic poster you've designed for so many shows, but also Rotterdam. Thank you very much for watching. Am I on Facebook? I don't know. Where should I be looking when I've got a camera there and a camera there? Again, I don't know. I am going to assume I am probably on live on Facebook as well as being live. Oh yeah, I've been waving. Great stuff. Okay, cool. I'm just going to assume all of you can hear me, and I'm going to start this session. So thank you very much for watching. My name's John. My name's John Brittain. I'm a writer, and today I'm going to be talking about The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh as part of the King's Head Book Club. If you've been able to read the book, do send me any questions or thoughts. I can definitely see them on Facebook, and I mean, you're getting an idea of how completely au fait with technology I am. I can definitely get them on Facebook. Less sure about Instagram, but I've asked Alex at the King's Head to send me any questions I don't reply to. Do throughout the chat, do send on any questions or thoughts. I'll read them out, respond to them. We're going to talk about this play by Martin McDonagh from 2003. First produced at the National Theatre. I'll tell you a bit about myself, and then I'll tell you a bit about why I've chosen the play. And then we'll go. Great stuff. I'm a writer for theatre and also a director. I started writing about 10 years ago. I've written lots of stuff, often comedy or sort of using comedy in order to tell a dramatic story. The play I'm probably best known for is the play Rotterdam that was on at Theatre 503. But a couple of years before that, I worked at the King's Head for a year as a box office manager. So it's a theatre that's very close to my heart, and we've done performances of my show Margaret Thatcher, Queen of Soho there, I love the theatre. I'm also a director. I've directed comedians and also the play Baby Reindeer by Richard Gadd that was on last year. So that's why I'm here. The Pillowman. So I think The Pillowman was a play that I first encountered at university in 2006 probably. And I first encountered it as a script. And I've seen a couple of student productions, but really in my mind, it exists as the play, which is why I thought the play script, which is why I wanted to talk about it today, because I know that this is a play that works incredibly well on stage, but for me, it works incredibly well on the page as well. And so I think it's an interesting one to talk about. And I think there's an awful lot of ideas in the play. And it's also an incredibly well constructed piece of drama. So I've seen several student productions of it, some good, some not so good. But what I always come back to with Martin McDonagh's plays is just how elegant they are, how well told they are as stories. And this is true of he was a prolific writer from a young age. So I think I'm right in saying he was born in 1970. And in the 1990s, he produced 2 trilogies of plays, all set in rural Ireland, although one of the plays wasn't produced. The Beauty Queen of Lenan, The Lonesome West, The Cripple of Inishmaan, and The Lieutenant of Inishmore, and A Skull in Connemara. And each one of them is an incredibly elegantly told story. He often uses quite a simple structure, but gets the most out of it. He is tricksy writer in some ways. You know, he likes, but a lot of his tricks are through the way the story is told, not through not through big dramatic devices. He is fantastic with plot. and, like I say, containing it all in one elegant package. So the Pillowman, this was his first play not to be set in rural Ireland, and it, if my research is to be believed, came out of him reading grim fairy tales and sort of classic fairy tales, but reading the original versions of them and seeing how dark they were and seeing how violent often, and how the sanitized versions of them that we have now are not reflective of the original stories. So he started writing some of his own. Now, I haven't read these, but from my research, they have got some great names. We've got The Chair and the Wolf Boy, The Short Fellow, and The Strange Frog, and The Violin and the Drunken Angel. So these stories started coming about, and then presumably at some point he decided to collect some of these stories, or stories in this style, into the play The Pillowman, which appropriately is a play about storytelling, the effect of stories, where stories come from, and what they mean, and what they mean to different people. It was a little bit of trivia. It originally premiered as a rehearsed reading at the Finborough Theatre in West London, and that was in 1995, and that was in the same season as Shopping and Fucking by Mark Ravenhill, which for anyone who went to university and studied drama in the mid 2000s, Shopping and Fucking, The Pillowman, and Top Girls by Carol Churchill were unavoidable. It was you had to, they're the plays that everyone read, at least at UEA. It was got a celebrated production at the National Theatre under Nicholas Hytner, not directed by Nicholas Hytner, and it was directed by someone who I have forgotten the name of because I've. It was directed by John Crowley, of course, and starred David Tennant, Jim Broadbent, very exciting for Harry Potter fans, as well as Nigel Lindsay and Adam Godley. It won the Olivier for Best Play in 2004. It got many good reviews, but I thought I would start with. I thought I would just read out this one from Toby Young from The Spectator, which I just found very amusing. This is a hopelessly disorganized play in which the action keeps grinding to a halt so the main character can read out one of a half dozen or so interminable short stories. It felt less like an evening at the theatre than being trapped in a creative writing workshop. I left in the interval. So I'm not going to lie. I think he made the wrong call there. I think it's a very good play, but also I can't understand. Hey, it's all subjective, but I can't understand how you would look at The Pillowman and say it's disorganized. I think one of the, as I keep coming back to, one of the brilliant things about this play is how it unfolds like a puzzle, and such a well constructed whole. Maybe it's because he left at the interval, and I think we can all agree you can't judge something unless you watched all of it. Anyway, and before we start talking about the plot and the characters, I thought I would just read out a little anecdote from Nicholas Hytner's book, Balancing Acts, about running the National Theatre, because I thought this, again, it's revealing in a different way, but Nicholas Hytner says, after the first run-through of The Pillowman, I told Martin McDonagh that it was the best play he'd ever written. No, he replied, it's the best play anyone has ever written. It was a joke, but as with all Martin's jokes, you could only just tell. And that always really amuses me whenever I think about that story. Because it is a very, very good play, and I'm sure many people have made the case that it's one of the best ever written. At least one of the best in recent times. Personally, I am delighted by the idea of a writer actually saying that and having the chutzpah to say that. But I think it also comes down to there's something in there, and maybe this is me making links, but about the meaning of things and about the meaning being contained, about the meaning of something, whether it be a joke, whether it be a story, being put out into the world as a provocation. And do you read into that what it literally means or seems to mean? Do you look further? Do you apply your own meaning to it? And I think that these are all things contained within the Pillowman. The idea um, of what stories mean, whether they mean the thing that the creator thought they meant, and whether who's reading them in what time changes how they mean. And I think that's interesting, just because you can then step back from the play and look at the Pillowman and say, well, how has it changed since its inception? So, for those of you who would like it, I'll do a little bit of a plot recap. So, the Pillowman is set in a dystopian world. We're never quite sure where, but there's lots of hints that it essentially is an authoritarian police state. Katurian is a writer of short stories who has been brought in for interrogation, although at the beginning of the play he doesn't know why. He meets two police officers, Topolsky and Ariel, who are interrogating him, and it slowly emerges over the first half that a crime has been committed, although he doesn't know what it is. During this interrogation, they read out some of his stories, and we start to see that these stories, these fairy tales that he writes, are incredibly violent and gruesome, and often have dark implications for the children involved in them. They suffer or have been implied to have been abused. During this act, we also find out that his brother, who has learning difficulties, is also being held and possibly tortured. And at the end of that act, we find out that the reason Katurian is being held there is because children have been murdered in the style of his stories. During this, we also hear some of his stories. Oh, hello, we've got a question. So I think I'm going to interrupt my synopsizing. Do you think it will feel dated when it's on later this year? Have offensive jokes become less funny as people become more easily offended? And that's from Rebecca. So I've paused the synopsizing here. I certainly found when reading it that particular words really leapt out at me in a way that they probably wouldn't have in 2003. Words that were sort of in common parlance in movies and TV shows, and interestingly, I found the words more of a block than the stories themselves, in a way, because some of the and the jokes themselves, the jokes kind of felt like the black humor of the jokes, to me, still felt like it chimed and felt appropriate to the characters, and it didn't feel gratuitous. But some of the language they used, it's interesting. Certain words are used with a real sense of intent, and that they know that they're going to shock, while other words, which might not have been so shocking at the time, are used far less carefully. And obviously don't want to say any of these words. But I think, yes, it certainly has dated in that respect. But I think that for me, it's sort of more about the execution than it is about the actual than the actual impulse behind the kind of shock humour and the offensive stories and language. What do other people think, guys? Did it date for you? What stood out for you in that story? Was there anything where it really clanged against you? I mean, personally, the fact that they weren't maintaining 2 meters distance really that dated it for me. I was like, guys, don't go near Katurian. You don't know what he's got. But so going back to my synopsizing, as the story goes on, we meet, I don't know if it's Michael or Mikhail, because I haven't seen very many productions. I haven't seen productions of this in years, so I don't know actually how that name is pronounced, but I'll go with Michael for now. Michael arrives, and it slowly becomes clear that he has committed those murders in imitation of the stories that Katurian writes. It also comes out that Michael was abused as a child by their parents, and in an attempt to make Kachurian a better writer. And you start to see as it sort of unfolds how a lot of the stories are reflective of either Kachurian's experience or Michael's experience, or his imagining of Michael's experience. When Kachurian finds out that Michael has killed these two children and a third potentially, he kills Michael and tries to make a deal with Topolsky and Ariel to save his stories in exchange for his confession. But slowly it comes out that he actually doesn't know all the details of the stories, that he obviously hasn't committed these crimes, and actually that the final child who was abducted, Michael, hasn't actually killed, but is in fact dressed up as a character from his favourite story, and the only story that we hear that hasn't got an incredibly gruesome ending in it, called The Little Green Pig. But the police officers, particularly Topolsky, doesn't care. This isn't a mitigating factor, and he still carries on with executing Kachurian, and also says that he's going to burn all of his stories. And we're left at the end of the play with Kachurian dead, and the stories being saved at the last minute by the other interrogator, Ariel, who locks him in a file for 50 years. So there's the implication that at some point these stories are going to be rediscovered. So the characters in the play, just sort of talking briefly, and again, I'll take one little break here for questions. Do you find other work helps inspire your own, or is it distracting? Oh, great. Guys, we'll take a short break from the Pillowman to talk about me. Do you find other work helps you inspire your own, or is it distracting? I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question for every artist or writer or director, is how much is immersing yourself in someone else's work useful, and how much do you end up sort of parroting that? And I think that there's no right answer. And particularly at the beginning of your career, I think you probably do start trying to just do impressions of the people that you really like. I certainly spent a year in my life, very, very ill-advisedly, it must be said, trying to do an impression of Dennis Kelly. And what it meant was that I wrote lots of plays that weren't very good Dennis Kelly plays, and they were particularly bad me plays. But I also think that those imitations are often helpful to teach you certain lessons. So actually, you might not have developed your voice or your intentions to the point where you can fully express everything you want to do. But if you can sort of lean on something that another writer has done really well that you love, you can sometimes use that to find out other things about what you like. So, you might lean on their sort of dialogue style, but actually that allows you to unlock how you like to write characters. Equally with directing, you might take a trope or take something that you've seen in someone else's work and use it in yours, but by using it, you start to adapt it and start to fit it into your own sensibilities. And I think that's what happens as your career goes on. I think for me, because actually sometimes it's quite useful to go, I'm going to write a Martin McDonagh style play, or a Laura Wade style play, or whatever. But it's quite useful to sort of start from a provocation of, I'm going to get away from the last thing I did, and I'm going to use someone else as the starting point. Because once you have developed your voice, once you have got more of a sense of who you are as a writer, I think, or as a director, or as anything, but I think you take that provocation doesn't become that provocation doesn't turn into you just copying their plays. It turns into you interpreting what they do through the lens of yourself and your own sensibilities. So I think I don't think there's any one right answer to that question. I think it works differently for different people, and I think it works differently at different points in your career. and Fiona has said very nicely, I would love to see your Martin McDonagh play. Well, it is called The Duvet Man, and it's set in a dystopian world where a director. No, anyway, right back to the Pillowman. You've got various. We've got basically four central characters in the Pillowman, and each of them, each of the main two has a relationship with stories, and so too do the supporting characters. But the central conflict, at least as established in the first scene, between Kachurian and Topolsky, Kachurian sort of lives his life through stories. His great desire is to be this brilliant writer. He values the stories more than he values his life. And yet at the same time, he has a conflicting attitude to what they mean to him. He claims that they're not autobiographical, but they transparently are. He claims that he's got this confused line at the beginning where he says the first duty of a storyteller is to tell a story, but then that changes to the only duty of a storyteller and then changes back. Those are two very different propositions. Stories are incredibly important to him, and yet he doesn't quite seem to have worked out what he wants from his stories, or whether he wants anything from his stories, whether he wants to do anything with them. He's sending them out into the world, but beyond their importance as stories, as plots, he doesn't necessarily have a clear relationship with them. I feel, obviously, feel free to disagree. Detective Topolsky, on the other hand, has a very clear idea of what he thinks stories should be. Or at least in terms of his own story that he writes, which is a far less disguised, but also a far more confused autobiography. But I think Topolsky, for me anyway, if I was approaching this show as a performer, which I don't approach any shows as, but I'm imagining. But if I was approaching it as a performer, I think Topolsky would be the part that I would love to play. I think that there's something incredibly chilling, for me anyway, in how much power Topolsky has, and how little values he has, or actually what he's using that power for. He's not invested necessarily in actually maintaining order or bringing justice. He's invested in his job of wielding power. And I think it's a really great portrayal of someone who has maybe never had, but has lost any sort of guiding principles in how they're going to use their power, and purely uses it for its own ends. In contrast to that, Detective Ariel has personal experience of abuse as a child, which he brings into his work. He is incredibly brutal as a police officer. He seems to enjoy torture. He doesn't really have any qualms about having tortured the wrong people, but he is driven by a sort of righteous ire, and also is the one who is most resistant to the stories. Topolsky can kind of talk about them in a critical way. He can sort of enter into a dialogue with Kachurian, but sort of Ariel doesn't want to know. He hates them because in my interpretation, but the ideas contained within those stories are offensive in and of themselves for him. He can't go near them. And then the final character is Michael, Kachurian's brother, who has a very confused relationship with the stories, in that he seems to interpret some of them incredibly innocently, and yet at the same time also interprets them as provocations to go and murder children. So Michael is this character who sees the stories for what he wants to see them as, and not what they actually are. Whereas I think Topolsky sees the stories in the way that best fits the case he wants to make against Kachurian, and Ariel sees the stories as sort of offensive in and of themselves. But I think those characters are all incredibly well drawn, as many of McDonagh's characters are. And what I particularly like is each of, I mean, in a way, this is quite basic stuff, but I just enjoy that each of them has their own journey through the play. And there are reveals of character traits, character history that mirror the sort of twists in the story that Kachurian is telling. The idea that Ariel had a history of being abused as a child, the idea that Topolsky might have lost a child. Each of them is sort of presented as this kind of archetype, and slowly the layers are pulled away in, I think, a really skillful way. So those are the characters in the play. And then, so really what I would love now, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. What I would absolutely love is any more questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes, but I'd also really love to hear your thoughts on the show. If anyone's messaged on Instagram, I'm really sorry, I can't see it. But if Fiona, if you can see any comments on Instagram, do repost them in Facebook. So I'll sort of wrap up now in terms of what I take away from the play, and hopefully maybe some of that chimes with you, or you'll disagree with it. It's all fine. Like I say, I really think this is a play about the power of stories and the meaning of stories, and how stories enter into the world and sometimes become different to the intent is misinterpreted or taken differently. I think it's a really fantastic portrayal of the sort of fear of a police state, particularly in those early scenes where Kachurian is desperate not to be seen as political, in that you're questioning everything. That sort of police state is a really great setting for this story, because you are being asked to question everything you're seeing in the stories that Kachurian is telling, but you're also having to question the reality of what's going on. Is Michael really in the next room? Has the girl really been murdered? Does Topolsky know more than he says? Do all these characters, are they telling you the truth, the audience? There's a great line where Kachurian says, what do you know when... I'm going to butcher this line, but essentially he says you don't know anything more than what has literally been presented. If a character in a story tells you something, all you know is that character has told you it. It doesn't mean that it's true. And I think that setting it in a police state really just completely puts a rocket beneath that idea, because it makes you question everything. I'm just going to look at the question. Do you think Michael should be played by a non-neurotypical actor? I think probably yes, and I think that's certainly that. If I was directing it, that's certainly one of the first discussions that I would have, and I think that personally I would come down on the and cast a non-neurotypical actor in the role of Michael. My experience is that those choices are really important, and actually when you're directing a play or producing a play, often it's really, really easy just to go back to the default, because it's easier, essentially, and to default to sort of able-bodied, neurotypical, cis white people. And I've been guilty of that in the past, and I think that that's an important decision to make very early on, and then to set it in stone and make sure it happens, and not sort of be half-hearted about it and sort of going, "Oh, we'd like to do that." I think if you make that decision, you have to make that decision and then carry through on it. But yes, I think that would probably be the right decision, and I think it would bring something to that character that probably hasn't been brought before in any productions that I'm aware of. Would I describe it as a debate play? I personally would, and this sort of ties back into what I'm going to say. I'm aware that I'm probably going to have to wrap this up in the next minute or so. It's really interesting. I once saw this play at the National Student Drama Festival, and I came out and another director said, "Oh, I really hated that." And I asked why. and he said because it says that stories tell people how to behave, and then they do it, and he rejected that. I don't think it does say that. I think it asks that question, and I think that question is one that we are grappling with at the moment, and will always grapple with. Of to what degree does the portrayal of something perpetuate that thing? Is the portrayal of something sort of does the portrayal of violence sort of tacitly endorse violence in some way, or accept it as a sort of inevitability of the world? Are people influenced by the things they write? So, for instance, we were talking about shock humour or those offensive jokes. Does putting those words in this story mean that audience members feel that they have approval to use them in life? Personally, I think if I'm interpreting Heather, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, yes, I would describe it as a debate play, because I think those questions are raised both explicitly and implicitly in the show, but I don't see answers as being given. I actually see a lot of the time where it seems like the play is saying, yes, Michael kills these children because of the stories. I think there are other options presented to us as well through the story and through the text, and I think in some ways, I think it's a very subtle portrayal of how stories go out there into the world, and actually some people launch upon stories for their own means and sort of twist their meanings and say, look, well, you must have meant this because this ties in with this thing. And sometimes people bring their own famous essay / book Death of the Author, where I'm going to butcher my explanation of this, but the idea that once a story or a play has been put out into the world, it's not necessarily so important what the author intended, but people who read it bring their own interpretations. They create the story anew each time they read it, and I think that's contained within this story as well. Yes, I do think it's a debate play. It certainly raises questions for me, and I think as I come back to as a final point, and I will stop now. I promise, King's Head, I will stop. But for me, the idea of structuring things as stories and how that neatens them up, and I think there are lines in the play that pertain to this. I think Couturian sort of saying there's actually no such thing as a happy ending. But I think by virtue of that, there's no such thing as a sad ending either. There's no such thing as an ending. Things just carry on. But in a story, we package them all neatly, and you can certainly see that in the way that Couturian is using his stories as a way of trying to work through what happened in his childhood, what happened to Michael in his childhood. Although by working through that in his own way, it provides material for other people to, or sort of ammunition for other people to take those stories and bend them to what they want. But I think within the play itself, there's a kind of paradox in that it's a play about the messiness of stories, the messiness of putting things out into the world, the sort of mess of where those stories come from. Are they autobiographical? Are they not? And it's a play for me about the messiness of telling stories, and yet it is an incredibly neat, well constructed, and very satisfying whole. So I think there's a paradox in there, but that again, that's something I enjoy about it, and I personally find this play very rich, and I find new things come out each time I read it, and I hope that you've enjoyed reading it and enjoyed me babbling on about it. So I think if that's okay, and Fiona, maybe you can just give me a wave if this is the case. But I think that is going to be the end of my book club. But the King's Head are doing these videos every day from 1:00 till 1:30. So every weekday there'll be another book club next week, and there'll be skills sharing sessions, question and answer sessions. There was one with I think one with Rebecca, who's been commenting last week, and there'll be more coming up. And so please do tune into this channel at 1:00 every day. Other people will probably actually do the right time and not run over by 5 minutes. So I'm going to stop there. But thank you so much for watching. And I don't know if this video gets posted in Facebook. Maybe there'll be more comments below. But do continue the conversations between yourselves. Do continue thinking, and I look forward to watching next week's book club. So thank you very much, everyone, and bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.